The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on heavy ivory cardstock with a wax seal pressed into the corner, and it was the kind of thing that made the entire social circle of the city stop and whisper. Victoria Sterling, the youngest chief executive in the history of Sterling Group, was turning 36, and her birthday celebration was already the most anticipated event of the season. Senators wanted to attend. Studio executives wanted to attend. Men who owned airlines and women who owned fashion houses had already confirmed their seats, but the single name that spread through the drawing rooms and boardrooms of the city faster than any other was not a name anyone recognized. It belonged to a man named Ethan Carter, and nobody in that glittering world had ever heard of him before. By evening, the questions had multiplied into something close to a scandal. Was he a foreign investor? Was he a secret partner in one of her overseas deals? Was he, perhaps, nobody at all? A mistake in the mailing list that some overworked assistant would be fired for come morning. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth was too plain and too quiet to survive in a world built on spectacle. Ethan Carter was simply a man who lived 3 neighborhoods away from the tallest building Sterling Group owned. A man who fixed his own leaking faucet, drove a car with over 100,000 miles on it, and had not worn a tuxedo since his wife's funeral 11 years earlier. On the night of the party, when the doors of the grand ballroom finally opened, and he walked through them in a suit that did not quite match the cut of the season, every head in the room turned at once. And then, before anyone could laugh, before anyone could finish forming the joke on their lips, Victoria Sterling crossed that entire ballroom in her silver gown, took the microphone from a startled MC, and said the words that would freeze 300 of the wealthiest people in the city into absolute silence. "I want to introduce someone to all of you," she said, her voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "This is my fiancé." No one moved. No one breathed, and somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a man named Daniel Brooks, who had spent the entire evening believing that ring on Victoria's hand was destined for his own pocket, felt the champagne glass in his hand grow suddenly, unbearably heavy. 3 days earlier, Ethan Carter had been standing in his kitchen, holding a piece of cardstock so fine it felt like it belonged in a museum rather than his hand, reading his own name printed in gold lettering beside an address he had never visited. He turned it over twice, checked the envelope for another name, and found nothing but his own. His life did not intersect with people who sent invitations like this. He was an ordinary man in every sense the word could hold, a man who bought his coffee from the same shop every morning, who nodded at the same neighbors, who had spent the last several years building a life so quiet that hardly anyone outside his small circle knew what he had once been capable of. He set the invitation on the counter and told himself, with the calm certainty of someone used to being overlooked, that it had been sent to him by mistake. That certainty lasted until the following afternoon, when his phone rang with a number he did not recognize, and a composed young woman introduced herself as the personal assistant to Victoria Sterling. She confirmed, in a tone that suggested she fielded far stranger calls than this one every single day, that the invitation was not an error. "Miss Sterling had specifically requested his presence," she said, and she hoped he understood the significance of the request. Ethan asked, carefully, whether there had been some confusion, because he did not know a Victoria Sterling, had never done business with her company, and could not imagine what reason a woman of her standing would have to seek him out. The assistant's answer was brief and deliberately vague, the kind of vagueness that trained professionals use when they have been told exactly how much to reveal, and not one word more. She said only that Miss Sterling remembered a night several months earlier, a rainy road outside the city, and a stranger who had stopped to help without asking for anything in return. Ethan went quiet on the other end of the line. He remembered that night too, though he had never thought of it as anything more than an ordinary act of decency. The kind of thing any person with working hands and a spare hour should do for someone stranded in bad weather. He had not asked her name that night. He had not wanted to know it. For 2 days he told himself he would decline. He had no interest in ballrooms, no patience for crowds that measured a man by his watch or his shoes, and every instinct told him that walking into that hotel would only invite trouble into a life he had worked hard to keep simple. But something about the assistant's careful phrasing bothered him. A sense that there was more beneath the surface than a simple thank you extended 6 months late. And so, on the evening of the party, dressed in the only suit he owned that still fit him properly, Ethan Carter decided he would go. Not because he wanted to be part of that world, but because he wanted to look this woman in the eye and ask her, plainly, why she had brought him into it. The lobby of the hotel alone was larger than his entire apartment building. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from ceilings painted with gold leaf, and a line of black cars stretched down the block outside, each one disgorging men in tailored jackets and women wrapped in fabric that cost more than his yearly salary. Ethan walked through the revolving doors and felt, for the first time in over a decade, the specific discomfort of being looked at. Hundreds of eyes lifted toward him as he crossed the threshold into the ballroom, and every single one of them seemed to be asking the same silent question. Who is this man, and why is he here? The whispering began almost immediately, rippling outward from cluster to cluster like a stone dropped into still water. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward her companion and murmured that he must be some kind of contractor, perhaps here to fix something before the party started. A man near the bar suggested, loudly enough for Ethan to hear, that he had likely wandered in from the wrong event down the hall. Daniel Brooks, standing near the center of the room in a jacket cut by a tailor, whose waiting list stretched past a year, laughed outright when a colleague pointed Ethan out to him, and made no effort to lower his voice as he asked whether Sterling Group had started hiring its birthday guests from a temp agency. Near the champagne fountain, Margaret Sterling stood with the rigid posture of a woman accustomed to controlling every variable in a room. And the sight of Ethan Carter standing awkwardly near the entrance was, to her, an unacceptable variable. She had spent months quietly steering her daughter toward Daniel, toward the kind of marriage that would keep the family's holdings intact and the board of directors comfortable, and the presence of this unremarkable stranger felt like sabotage aimed directly at her careful plans. She did not approach him. She simply watched him from across the room with an expression sharp enough to cut glass, and made a note to find out, before the night ended, exactly who had let him through the door. Several members of the Sterling Group board had gathered near a private alcove, their conversation shifting quickly from quarterly earnings to the strange guest now standing alone by a marble column. One of them suggested, half joking, that this must be some elaborate publicity stunt orchestrated by their CEO, a woman known for surprising the press when it suited her business interests. Another board member, less amused, muttered that stunts were fine in a press release, but embarrassing in front of 300 of the city's wealthiest people. Neither of them noticed that Victoria herself had not yet appeared. That the guest of honor remained absent, while her uninvited-looking guest stood exposed to every judgment in the room. Ethan felt every one of those judgments settle onto his shoulders like a physical weight. He scanned the crowd for a familiar face and found none. No sign of the woman whose voice he remembered from a rainy night months ago. No explanation for why he had been summoned into a room full of people who so clearly believed he did not belong. The urge to leave rose in him with a quiet, practical logic. The same logic that had guided most of his decisions since his wife's death. There was no reason to stay somewhere he was not wanted. No reason to let strangers study him, like an exhibit in a museum he had never asked to enter. He set down the glass of water someone had pressed into his hand and turned toward the door. A young woman in a black blazer intercepted him before he reached it, introducing herself softly as the same assistant who had called him days earlier. She placed a gentle hand near his arm, not touching him, simply blocking his path with the quiet authority of someone used to managing far more difficult situations than this. "Please wait just a few more minutes," she said, her eyes carrying an apology she did not put into words. "Miss Sterling asked me specifically to make sure you stayed." Ethan hesitated, torn between the instinct to leave and a curiosity he could not quite explain, and in that hesitation, the room around him seemed to shift. A murmur swept through the crowd, rising in volume like wind moving through tall grass. And every head turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom. Victoria Sterling stood at the top of it in a gown, the color of dark silver, her hair swept back in a style that made the diamonds at her throat look almost restrained by comparison. She paused at the top of the stairs for exactly as long as she needed to locate him in the crowd. And then, without acknowledging a single one of the hundreds of people calling her name, she began walking directly toward Ethan Carter. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as she crossed the marble floor, her heels clicking in a rhythm that felt deliberate, unhurried, entirely certain. Photographers who had been stationed near the entrance for exactly this kind of moment lifted their cameras instinctively, unsure what they were capturing but certain it mattered. Daniel Brooks straightened his jacket and stepped forward, assuming, as he had assumed all evening, that Victoria's arrival meant it was finally time for the moment he had been waiting months to claim. He was wrong. And the realization hit him the instant Victoria walked past him without so much as a glance, her eyes fixed entirely on the man standing near the door. She stopped in front of Ethan and extended her hand, not for a handshake, but in the manner of someone inviting a partner onto a dance floor. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice pitched only for him, though every camera in the room had already begun capturing the moment. Ethan looked at her hand, then at her face, searching for some flicker of recognition of the woman from that rainy road, and found it there in her eyes, unmistakable and warm, despite the calculated stillness of everything else around her. "Dance with me," she said. "Just once. I will explain everything after." He should have refused. Every rational instinct in him argued for refusal, for the safety of walking away from a spectacle that clearly had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with some larger game he did not understand. But there was something in the way she asked, something almost desperate beneath the composed surface, that made him place his hand in hers instead. The orchestra shifted into a slow waltz, as though cued precisely for this moment. And Victoria Sterling, CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the country, led an unknown man in an ill-fitting suit onto the center of the dance floor, while 300 of the city's elite watched in stunned silence. The photographs taken in those 3 minutes would circulate through every business publication and gossip column by morning. But in the moment itself, neither Victoria nor Ethan seemed aware of the cameras at all. She spoke softly as they moved, thanking him again for coming, apologizing for the spectacle she knew this had become, promising him an explanation the instant she found a private moment to give one. Ethan said little in return, his attention split between the strange comfort of dancing with a stranger who somehow did not feel like a stranger, and the mounting fury visible on Daniel Brooks's face from across the room. Daniel did not wait for the dance to end. He crossed the floor with the stiff, controlled anger of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and positioned himself near the edge of the dance floor, where Victoria could not avoid seeing him. Margaret Sterling arrived only seconds later, gripping her daughter's arm the moment the music slowed, pulling her toward a quiet alcove behind a wall of white orchids. "What is this?" Margaret demanded, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the party. "Who is this man? And why are you humiliating this family in front of every person who matters?" Victoria did not answer with the explanation her mother wanted. She simply said that everything would become clear soon, that she needed her mother to trust her for just a little longer, and that whatever happened next was not open for negotiation. Margaret's expression hardened into something colder than anger, a look reserved for moments when she realized her carefully built plans were slipping past her control, but she said nothing further, as Victoria turned and walked back toward the center of the room. The tension between them lingered in the air like static, visible to anyone paying close enough attention, though most of the crowd remained too fixated on Ethan to notice. The moment arrived when the enormous, three-tiered cake was wheeled to the center of the ballroom, its surface dusted in gold leaf, candles flickering along its base in a shape that spelled out Victoria's age in elegant script. The room quieted in anticipation of the traditional toast. Glasses lifted, cameras angled, the entire evening narrowing toward this single ceremonial pause. Victoria stepped forward, accepted a microphone from her assistant, and let her gaze travel slowly across the sea of faces that had spent the entire evening speculating about the stranger beside her. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice carrying the practiced calm of a woman who had addressed shareholders far more hostile than this crowd. "But before I cut this cake," she continued, "there is something I need all of you to know." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel unbearable, and reached her hand toward Ethan, who stood frozen a few feet away, with no idea what was about to happen. "I want to introduce someone to all of you," she said, her fingers finding his and holding firm despite the visible tension in his posture. "This is Ethan Carter, and he is my fiancé." The words landed like a physical shock across the ballroom. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Daniel Brooks's jaw tightened until the muscle along his cheek visibly flexed. Margaret Sterling's face drained of color. And somewhere in the crowd, Oliver Grant, a board member who had said little all evening, watched the scene unfold with the narrow, calculating stillness of a man already rearranging every plan he had built around the assumption that Daniel would soon control half of Sterling Group through marriage. Applause eventually broke out, scattered and uncertain, the kind of applause people offer when they do not know what else to do with their hands. And through it all, Ethan Carter stood perfectly still, his heart pounding, utterly certain that whatever explanation was coming, it would not be simple. The moment the last guests drifted toward the exits and the orchestra packed away its instruments, Victoria led Ethan through a service corridor into a private suite on the hotel's upper floor, away from any camera or curious ear. She closed the door behind them and exhaled for what seemed like the first time all evening, her composed public mask slipping just enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath. Ethan remained near the door, arms crossed, waiting for the explanation she had promised him on the dance floor. "I am sorry," she said immediately. Before he could speak, "I know I put you in an impossible position tonight, and you deserve to understand exactly why." She told him everything in careful, measured sentences. The way a woman used to controlling information finally allows herself to release it all at once. The board of Sterling Group, led quietly by a man named Oliver Grant, had been pressuring her for over a year to secure what they called stability, a euphemism, she explained, for marrying someone whose financial interests aligned neatly with the company's largest shareholders. Daniel Brooks had been their chosen candidate from the beginning, a man whose investment fund already held a significant stake in Sterling Group, a man who would, upon marriage, gain influence over decisions that were rightfully hers alone. If she refused to announce an engagement before the fiscal quarter closed, the board intended to use a clause buried deep in her father's original founding documents, a clause that allowed them to challenge her leadership if certain stability conditions were not met. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had begun to shift from confusion toward a quiet, wary understanding. "So this is not real," he said finally, "just a performance to protect your position." Victoria nodded, unable to meet his eyes for a moment. "A temporary arrangement," she said. "A public engagement, nothing more, just long enough to buy time and find another solution to Oliver's maneuvering." She explained that she had thought of him specifically, out of every man she could have chosen, because of that single night on the rainy road, because a stranger who asked for nothing in return had proven himself, in her mind, more trustworthy than any of the men circling her boardroom. "I am asking a great deal of you," she admitted, "and I understand if the answer is no." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request against everything he had built his life around. Avoiding. The visibility, the scrutiny, the sense of being used as a tool in someone else's carefully constructed game. He had spent 11 years protecting his privacy with a discipline bordering on obsession, and everything about this arrangement threatened to unravel that protection in front of the entire country. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I am sorry for what you are going through, but I cannot be part of this." He left the suite without waiting for her response, walking back through the service corridor and out a side entrance where no photographers waited, disappearing into the ordinary night as though the last 3 hours had never happened. Victoria stood alone in the empty room for a long while afterward, the weight of the evening pressing down on her chest, and found herself thinking not about the board, or Daniel, or her mother's fury, but about a rainy road 6 months earlier, and the quiet certainty in a stranger's voice as he knelt beside her broken-down car. That night had begun as an act of rebellion against her own carefully managed life. Exhausted by a week of board meetings and press obligations, Victoria had slipped away from her usual security detail. dressed in plain clothes, and driven herself out of the city alone, seeking nothing more than an hour of anonymity on an empty highway. The storm had arrived without warning, rain hammering the windshield until visibility collapsed entirely, and somewhere along a stretch of road with no streetlights, her car had sputtered, coughed, and died completely. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes in the dark. Phone battery nearly gone. No idea how far the nearest town might be, before a pair of headlights slowed and stopped behind her. The man who stepped out into the rain was already soaked by the time he reached her window. His flashlight beam steadied despite the wind whipping around them both. He introduced himself simply as Ethan, asked no questions about who she was or why she was alone on that road so late, and set immediately to work examining her engine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before for people who mattered far less than a stranded stranger. It took him nearly half an hour, kneeling in mud and rain, to trace the problem to a corroded battery cable, and even longer to jury-rig a temporary fix using tools from his own trunk. When the engine finally turned over, Victoria reached into her bag and offered him every bill of cash she had on her, a gesture that felt, in the moment, entirely inadequate given what he had just done for her. Ethan refused it without hesitation, closing her hand gently around the money and pushing it back toward her. "Keep it," he said, wiping rain from his face with the back of his sleeve. "Everyone needs help sometime. Tonight it was you. Someday, it might be me." He wished her a safe drive home, climbed back into his own car, and disappeared into the storm without ever asking her name. She had thought about that sentence more times than she could count in the months that followed, turning it over during board meetings, during sleepless nights, during the slow, suffocating pressure of watching her family and her company try to fold her into a marriage she had never chosen for herself. It had lodged itself somewhere permanent inside her, a small proof that decency could exist without any expectation of return. And when Oliver Grant first raised his ultimatum about marriage and stability, her mind had gone immediately, instinctively, to the stranger who had knelt in the rain and asked for nothing. It had taken her private investigators nearly 3 weeks to identify him from nothing more than a first name and a description of his car. And when his full history finally surfaced, she had sat in her office reading it twice, stunned by the distance between the quiet man on that road and the name that had once meant something significant in a very different world. But that discovery came later. That night, driving home through the last of the storm, she knew only that she had met, for the first time in years, a person whose kindness carried no hidden calculation, and something in her had quietly, stubbornly refused to let that memory go. 2 days after Ethan walked out of the hotel suite, Victoria appeared at his apartment door unannounced, dressed simply, without an entourage, without the polish of the woman who had commanded a ballroom. She did not apologize again. Instead, she told him, plainly, that Oliver Grant intended to force a board vote within the month, a vote that could strip her of operational control over the company her father had built from nothing, and that Daniel Brooks stood ready to absorb that control the moment she was removed. She was not asking him to fall in love with her, she said. She was asking him to help her survive long enough to fight back properly, and she promised that whatever happened, she would find a way to make it worth the disruption to his life. Ethan studied her for a long time before answering, weighing the quiet dignity in her request against every instinct that told him to close the door and return to the life he had built so carefully. He thought of the rain, of the stranded car, of the strange thread connecting that ordinary night to this extraordinary request standing on his doorstep now. Finally, he agreed, though not without conditions of his own. No cameras inside his home, no public statements without his knowledge. And the moment the danger to her company passed, the arrangement would end cleanly, without complication. Victoria accepted every term without argument, relief visible in the set of her shoulders for the first time in weeks. The weeks that followed unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance, staged for an audience that never stopped watching. Photographers captured them at charity dinners, at gallery openings, at quiet restaurant tables, where Victoria taught Ethan, patiently and without condescension, how to navigate a world of assigned seating charts and unspoken social hierarchies. Financial reporters speculated endlessly about what the engagement meant for Sterling Group stock, and the share price wobbled visibly each time a new photograph surfaced. Investors trying to calculate whether this unexpected romance strengthened or weakened the company's leadership. Daniel Brooks, humiliated and furious, quietly commissioned an investigation into Ethan's background, certain that a man with no visible wealth and no public profile must be hiding something exploitable. The investigators found nothing they could use. No debts, no scandals, no history of the kind of opportunism Daniel had been counting on to expose. What they found, instead, confused them further. Fragments of a professional history that did not match the quiet, unremarkable man currently photographed beside the city's most powerful CEO. Oliver Grant, unsatisfied with Daniel's inconclusive results, quietly hired his own investigators to shadow Ethan directly, convinced that patience alone would eventually reveal the leverage he needed. Neither man realized, in those early weeks, that the greatest threat to their plans was not something hidden in Ethan's past, but something changing quietly in Victoria's heart with every dinner, every conversation, every unguarded moment that had nothing to do with performance at all. She noticed it first in small, unwelcome ways. The disappointment she felt on evenings when their public schedule required no appearance together, the attention she paid to his opinions on matters entirely unrelated to the arrangement between them, the way she found herself defending him instinctively when board members made dismissive comments about his background. She told herself repeatedly that this was simply the natural byproduct of spending so much time together under pressure, that gratitude and proximity were easily mistaken for something deeper. But late one evening, watching him fix a broken hinge on her office door with the same unhurried competence he had shown on that rainy road, she understood, with quiet unease, that she was no longer entirely certain where the performance ended, and something real began. The truth about Ethan Carter surfaced not through Daniel's investigators, but through an old colleague who recognized him at a charity gala and approached him with genuine warmth, addressing him by a title neither Victoria nor anyone else in the room expected. "Architect Carter," the man said, extending his hand with visible admiration. "It has been years." Victoria, standing beside Ethan in that moment, felt the ground shift slightly beneath her understanding of the man she had spent weeks growing close to. The colleague, unaware of the tension his words had created, spoke enthusiastically about a museum wing Ethan had designed over a decade earlier, a building still regarded as one of the most striking pieces of civic architecture built that generation. Before politely excusing himself and disappearing back into the crowd, Ethan offered little explanation that night, deflecting Victoria's questions with the same practiced quietness he used to deflect most inquiries into his past. But over the following days, in fragments offered during long car rides and quiet dinners, the fuller picture emerged. He had once been among the most sought-after young architects in the country, responsible for buildings that still anchored skylines in 3 different cities, a career trajectory that seemed destined for decades of acclaim. His wife, an interior designer he had met on his very first major commission, had been the quiet architecture behind his own success, the person who understood him well enough to soften his hardest edges and sharpen his best ideas. When she died suddenly of an illness that gave them barely 6 months of warning, Ethan had walked away from every project on his desk and never returned to the profession that had once defined him. Victoria listened to this history with a growing, uncomfortable sense of having misjudged him entirely, of having assumed simplicity, where there was instead a man who had deliberately chosen a smaller life after losing the person who made his larger one meaningful. She found herself admiring him more deeply for the choice, understanding instinctively that walking away from a claim required a different, quieter kind of courage than pursuing it ever did. Daniel Brooks, when his investigators finally uncovered the same information weeks later, saw only opportunity in it, certain that exposing Ethan's hidden past as a manipulation tactic, a secret identity concealed to win Victoria's sympathy, would finally give him the leverage he had been hunting for since the engagement began. He was catastrophically wrong about how the revelation would land. When the story broke in a business publication under Daniel's careful orchestration, framing Ethan as a man who had deceived Victoria by concealing his prestigious background, public sentiment moved in a direction none of them anticipated. Rather than reading the story as evidence of manipulation, readers and commentators alike found themselves moved by the quiet dignity of a man who had walked away from fame and fortune out of grief, who had chosen humility not as a disguise but as a genuine way of honoring the life he had lost. Sympathy for Ethan surged. Daniel's carefully planted story backfired so completely that it became, within days, the very thing that made the public fall in love with the engagement he had been trying to destroy. Furious and increasingly desperate, Oliver Grant abandoned subtlety entirely. He convened an emergency session of select board members, presenting a narrative he had spent weeks assembling, that Ethan Carter was a calculating opportunist who had engineered his way into Victoria's life for financial gain, using the Rainy Road story as a fabricated origin myth designed to manipulate her emotions. He demanded the board formally request that Victoria dissolve the engagement before the fiscal quarter's stability review, framing the demand as a matter of shareholder protection rather than personal interference. Margaret Sterling, still reeling from weeks of public embarrassment and genuinely uncertain whether her daughter's judgment could be trusted in matters of the heart, found herself standing uncomfortably close to agreement with Oliver's position for the first time. She confronted Victoria in private, laying out an ultimatum with the cold precision of a woman who believed she was protecting her daughter's legacy rather than destroying her happiness. "Choose the company," Margaret said, "or choose this man, but understand that you cannot have both if the board moves forward with its vote." Daniel, sensing an opening, orchestrated one final desperate gesture, proposing to Victoria publicly at a business summit, attended by nearly every major shareholder in Sterling Group, calculating that the pressure of the moment and the presence of the press would force her hand in his favor. Victoria stood before the cameras, before her mother's expectant face, before the entire assembled weight of everyone who wanted to decide her life for her, and refused him without hesitation, her voice carrying across the room with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. The refusal, broadcast within hours across every business news outlet in the country, pushed Oliver Grant past the point of careful maneuvering. He scheduled an emergency board vote for the following week, framing it publicly as a necessary response to what he called erratic and destabilizing leadership decisions, though everyone inside the company understood the vote for what it truly was, an attempt to remove Victoria from operational control before she could consolidate the personal and professional strength that seemed to be growing, unmistakably, with each passing day. The morning of the board vote arrived with a tension that seemed to press physically against the walls of Sterling Group's headquarters. Every major shareholder had gathered in the executive boardroom, Oliver Grant seated at the head of the table with the confident posture of a man certain his months of quiet maneuvering were finally about to pay off. Victoria sat across from him, composed but visibly aware of how narrow her margin for survival had become. What no one in that room expected was for the meeting's doors to open partway through Oliver's opening remarks, admitting a man none of the shareholders had ever seen inside these walls before. Ethan Carter walked to the front of the room without waiting for permission, carrying a folder thick with documents he had spent the last several nights assembling with the help of a forensic accountant Victoria had quietly hired weeks earlier. He had said almost nothing publicly since the engagement began, allowing Victoria to carry every burden of explanation and defense alone, but something in Oliver's escalating aggression had convinced him that silence was no longer a luxury either of them could afford. "My role in this situation began as something simple," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the stunned room. "But what I have learned since then is not simple at all, and I think everyone at this table deserves to hear it." He laid out, methodically and without theatrical flourish, a pattern of financial irregularities tracing back nearly 3 years, transactions that consistently routed value away from Sterling Group and toward a series of shell entities with quiet, indirect connections to Oliver Grant. He presented wire transfer records, offshore account documentation, and a timeline that aligned suspiciously well with several of the company's most controversial acquisitions Oliver had championed loudly at the time and profited from quietly ever since. The forensic accountant, present via video call, confirmed each document's authenticity as Ethan walked the board through it piece by piece, his architect's mind, for structural logic, proving unexpectedly suited to dismantling a financial conspiracy built layer upon layer. The reaction around the table shifted visibly as the presentation continued. Shareholders who had arrived that morning prepared to vote against Victoria, now exchanging uneasy glances, recalculating loyalties in real time as the true shape of Oliver's manipulation became impossible to ignore. Daniel Brooks, seated near the back of the room, felt the weight of his own complicity settle over him as several of the transactions Ethan described ran directly through investment vehicles his own fund had facilitated, whether knowingly or not no longer seemed to matter to the shareholders, now openly questioning his judgment. By the time Ethan finished speaking, the momentum that had carried Oliver into this room with such confidence had collapsed entirely, replaced by a growing, unmistakable demand for accountability, aimed squarely at the man who had orchestrated the entire vote. The board's decision, when it finally came, arrived not as the removal Oliver had engineered, but as his own swift departure from the company, escorted from the building before the afternoon ended, his reputation unraveling in real time across every financial news outlet that had spent weeks speculating about Victoria's fitness to lead. Daniel Brooks resigned his position on the board within days, his fund's reputation too closely tangled with the scandal to survive the scrutiny that followed. Victoria retained full control of Sterling Group. Her leadership validated not by a public relations campaign or a strategic marriage, but by the quiet, thorough work of a man who had asked for none of the credit he had just earned. After the boardroom emptied and the shareholders filed out still murmuring among themselves, Victoria found Ethan standing alone near the window, his folder of documents now closed on the table beside him, his posture the same quiet, unassuming stillness she had first noticed on that rainy road so many months ago. She thanked him, her voice thick with an emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly, and asked what she could possibly do to repay what he had just done for her company, for her family, for a fight that had never been his to begin with. Ethan offered her a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that carried more finality than warmth. "My part in this is finished," he said quietly. "The company is safe. You do not need me standing beside you for the cameras anymore." He began gathering his folder, moving toward the door with the same unhurried calm that had carried him through every strange turn of the last several months, and something in the simplicity of his departure struck Victoria harder than she anticipated. She had spent weeks telling herself that this arrangement was temporary, that whatever feelings had grown between them were complications to be managed rather than truths to be trusted, and watching him walk toward the exit now, she understood with sudden, undeniable clarity that she did not want him to leave at all. She caught up to him in the hallway outside the boardroom, her heels echoing against the marble floor in a rhythm that mirrored, almost exactly, the walk she had taken toward him across that ballroom months earlier. "Wait," she said, and something in her voice made him stop and turn. "This was never supposed to be real," she admitted, her composure slipping in a way she rarely allowed in front of anyone. "But somewhere between the rainy road and this hallway, it became real for me. I am not asking you to stay because the company needs saving anymore. I am asking because I do not want to imagine my life without you in it." Ethan studied her for a long moment, searching her face for the calculation he had half expected to find, and finding instead something unguarded and entirely genuine. He had told himself, throughout the last several months, that his feelings for her were simply the natural consequence of proximity and shared crisis, easily dismissed once the crisis passed. But standing in that hallway, watching her admit something that clearly cost her more than any board presentation ever had, he recognized the truth he had been avoiding since the night she first took his hand on that dance floor. "I stopped pretending a while ago too," he admitted quietly. "I just did not think it was my place to say so first." What happened next unfolded without cameras, without press releases, without a single calculated element of the performance that had defined their relationship from its very first public moment. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved a small velvet box he had been carrying for nearly a week without finding the courage to use it, and knelt down in the empty marble hallway of Sterling Group's headquarters. "This time," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the moment, I am not asking because anyone requires it of either of us. I am asking because I cannot imagine walking away from you again." Victoria's composed exterior finally broke entirely, tears sliding freely down her face as she said yes before he had even finished opening the box. Margaret Sterling learned of the real proposal, not through a press release, but through her daughter's own voice, trembling with a happiness Margaret had rarely heard in her since childhood, and something in that unguarded joy finally dismantled every reservation she had clung to about Ethan Carter. She had spent months judging him by the absence of the things she believed mattered: wealth, status, a name recognizable in the right rooms, and only now did she understand that her daughter had found something far rarer than any of those things. A man whose loyalty had proven itself under pressure that would have broken lesser commitments entirely. When she finally met him again, this time without an audience, without expectation, she extended her hand and admitted, quietly, that she had misjudged him badly. The engagement celebration that followed bore no resemblance to the spectacle of that first birthday party months earlier. There were no photographers, no orchestrated seating charts, no calculated performances staged for an audience of shareholders and society columnists. Instead, a small gathering of people who had actually earned their place in Victoria and Ethan's lives shared a quiet dinner on a rooftop overlooking the city. String lights replacing chandeliers, laughter replacing careful diplomatic conversation. Victoria wore no diamonds that night, only a simple ring that meant infinitely more to her than the one the world had watched her wear during the months of performance. And Ethan, for the first time since his wife's death, allowed himself to imagine a future built on something other than quiet solitude. A year passed, and the city that had once whispered about a mysterious stranger at Victoria Sterling's birthday party had long since moved on to newer gossip, newer scandals, newer names to speculate about over dinner tables. Sterling Group had grown stronger under Victoria's leadership, its stock steady, its reputation restored, the shadow of Oliver Grant's manipulation fading into a cautionary footnote in the company's history. Victoria remained exactly the leader she had always fought to be: decisive, respected, entirely capable of standing at the head of her father's company without needing anyone's permission to do so. Ethan, meanwhile, had returned quietly to the profession he once believed he had left behind permanently, though on terms entirely his own. He accepted no high-profile commissions, no gleaming corporate towers destined for magazine covers, choosing instead to lend his expertise as a consultant to projects that mattered in quieter, more essential ways: community centers, affordable housing developments, buildings meant to serve people rather than impress them. He and Victoria had established a foundation dedicated to rebuilding housing for families who had lost everything to disaster or hardship, funding it not as a public relations gesture, but as a genuine extension of the values that had brought the two of them together in the first place, on a rainy road where kindness had asked for nothing in return. On the anniversary of that first extraordinary night, the two of them sat together on the same rooftop where their real engagement had been celebrated a year earlier, the city stretching out beneath them, in a quiet constellation of lights. Victoria leaned against Ethan's shoulder, watching the skyline she had spent her entire career building a life around, and found herself thinking not of boardrooms or shareholders, but of the strange, improbable path that had led her here. "The night I told an entire room full of people that you were my fiancé," she said softly, "was the biggest lie I had ever told in my life. And it turned out to be the truest thing I ever did."